Hello everyone and welcome back to the recap show. Tonight we have round number 9 on the program and I just finished my game. I won this game, very fortunately, I have to admit, against the Polish player Pietruszewski Marcin, rated 22-39. So let's have a look. I was white, I played d4 and he went for the Nimzo Indian, which I played with this fourth e3, which is a very solid setup. White usually wants to develop his bishop to d3 and then his knight either to f3 or to e2, as we will see in the game. Castle, bishop d3, he went d5, which is probably the main system. Black could also go for c5, which leads to slightly different positions, but d5 is very classical. And now white has quite a few options at his disposal. Knight f3 is the main line, the so-called Karpov system, when after dc4, bishop c4, c5, castle, this is like a huge line. The main line continues like this, b6, I believe. And yeah, there's lots of theory there. And black tends to be pretty okay here, has also quite a few other lines. For example, after castle b6 is something I've played around with a couple of times, also decent system. Or knight c6 is also pretty good. So black is in pretty good shape here overall. Another line which has gained quite some popularity now is this a3, kind of inviting black to take on c3, and then white usually just wants to play this sort of position after c5, either knight f3 or knight e2, and white is generally hoping for the bishop pair in the long run, in case the position opens up, which is also definitely playable, but I went for this line c takes d5 here, which has kind of a harmless reputation. There's not so much happening in general, but it's just a position to play which comes out. There's not much theory, and that's kind of what I was striving for today. e5, and here I went for a3, which is again kind of like a sideline of a sideline. Knight g2 is by far the main continuation, and after something like rook e8, bishop d2, white in general plays most like rook c1, short castle, and in general in this position white really wants to push this f3 e4 if it's possible. If white gets this, he will get a great position in most cases, but black's antidote usually to this is that after f3, kind of the automatic response is to play c5, kind of with this saying that if one side wants to do something on this side or in the center as well, the other side should usually strike back immediately, and that's a perfect example for that as well. But I went for a3, which has gotten some popularity recently. I also checked this line pretty intensively when I was working for Hare Krishna as a second. He played it in a couple of games. And a3, bishop d6, queen c2, and this is kind of this relatively new line. White is intending to win the bishop pair with knight b5, and compared to the other line, now the queen is on c2, and white even has the option to castle long sometimes. So this is one of the ideas of this specific move order. And it forces black for a decision how to stop knight b5. He went a6. Black has also c6 is quite logical. Even b6 is possible, ignoring knight b5 and then c5. This is also one line which I like myself for black. So black has really many options. He went for a6, which is, I think, quite a decent line. Knight g2, rook e8. And here I went bishop d2, which is probably not the best choice. I should castle short immediately, but here I was just lazy to calculate bishop h2. I was pretty sure it doesn't work, but you always have to watch out for this, queen g5. But I guess there's just f4, and after queen h5 I can do something like bishop d2, and there's not so much to be afraid of. But I only knew that with bishop d2 in the game, now if I castle short, then this is never even shouldn't even think about this, because then I always have rook h1. This is kind of the trick. With the bishop being on d2, rook h1 is possible, and it stops all threats here. But castle would have been wiser, because now after knight d7 I would have b4, stopping c5, what happened in the game. Bishop d2, knight d7, castle c5, and yeah, with this move order, my opponent already comfortably equalized, maybe even had already the slightly better position, but I was not too worried. It was just a game, and yeah, it wasn't entirely obvious for him how to capitalize on his maybe slightly better position. I played d takes c5. What I also calculated during the game was rook 81, not immediately taking and kind of asking him what he wants to do. I guess he could go something like b6 as well and then bishop b7, but the line I mostly focused on was c4, which is kind of his idea of playing c5, and now bishop f5 is forced, g6, bishop h3. I don't want to give up this bishop on d7 just yet. And here I only calculated knight f8, bishop c8, rook c8, f3, and now I'm threatening to play e4. And after queen e7, I stopped I mean, I didn't see anything here, basically, I have to admit it, because I wanted to play e4, and now I thought queen e7 stops all of this, and black will simply continue with b5 slowly, rook b8, a5, b4, and I thought he's doing very well here. But here I have the amazing resource e4 still, and after d takes e4, bishop g5. And he has troubles because knight d5 is in the picture. Now f takes e4 is a huge threat, and if he takes, then rook takes f3. Again, he has big troubles along this this pin here. So this is a very nice resource which I missed during the game. But it turns out that after b5, black is anyway doing pretty well here. f3, bishop b7, and he stops this whole e4 plan with the bishop on b7 here. So yeah, I played d takes c5, not allowing him to play c4, knight c5, knight d4, and here he went for b6, which is probably not the correct plan. He wanted to fianchetto his bishop here, but it's quite passive on b7. It does defend the pawn on d5, but doesn't do anything apart from that. He should have moved one of the two knights to e4, knight fe4 or knight ce4, when he has a pretty good, pretty decent position. I always have to watch out for some sacrifices on h2 or even knight g4. And yeah, this would have been the way to go for him. But he went b6, which was not a bad move itself. The position is still around equal. And after knight e2, he went bishop b7. And here he could have capitalized after knight d3, queen d3, a5, and now bishop a6 to come, and he really has the more comfortable position. The point of knight c2 was that, first of all, I want to strengthen my knight on d4, this very important outpost here in this IQP position. And also I wanted to bring my bishop from d2 to c3, where it will finally do something, because if you look here, the bishop on d2 doesn't do anything at all. So that was the plan behind knight c2. Bishop b7, bishop c3, rook c8, rook 81. And I was in general never really afraid that he would take here. Because now at least there is this pair of pieces traded, and anyway, this whole constellation here was kind of awkward. The queen was in this file here, and if he takes, at least I have some room to breathe, and he will always have this pawn on d5, which is a weakness, and position still might be equal, but I would be more or less happy here. He went bishop b8, and I went bishop f5. Now I was kind of provoking him to move his rook to a more unfortunate square. I think that maybe he intended queen d6, but now I have knight f3, and this is quite awkward for him, because after rook d8 I can take on f6 and win the pawn on h7. I think this is what he missed when he played bishop b8. So he had to go rook c7, and now I went knight f3 anyway, again hinting at bishop f6 followed by bishop h7, winning a pawn. He went g6, and here I went to h3, which in hindsight I think was a good decision. At first I simply wanted to play bishop d3, because the bishop on h3 is a kind of out of the game. It's a bit strange here. First of all, at the first glance it doesn't seem like it does much, but I think it actually is a very important piece, because all of these squares are here protected. The rook cannot go to c8, the c-file will not be a big problem for me now, since also the other rook cannot go to c8. D7 square is protected, and what I also thought is that later my bishop could come to g2 via g3, and then the pawn on d5 could be attacked, which worked out perfectly in the game. So yeah, I was happy with bishop h3. The computer gave b4 here, which I didn't even consider. After gf, b, c5, this would be a good transformation for me, because now the pawn on f5 will drop, and his king is very weak. And after knight c4, he argues that now I can take, and the pawn cannot take because the queen on d8 is hanging. And after knight e4, something like queen b3. And now he starts to have some problems with this pawn. Also, my idea is to play bishop a1 followed by queen b2, and this diagonal could be problematic for black. Anyway, I went bishop h3, he went queen d6, and now I simply went queen b1, stepping out of this vis-a-vis position with the rook on c7. I always have to watch out for some mating ideas here on h2, but for now it doesn't. There's not much threatening. Also, the rook on c7 is blocking this battery here. He went a5 again. Knight e4 would be better. Because in the game he allowed me to take on f6 now. Knight e4, and after g3, bishop c6 is a very instructive plan when black has some counterplay with bishop b5 or bishop a4, hitting the rook on d1. He went a5 with the idea of playing bishop a6, but he's not really in time for that, and now I can take on f6 and play knight c3, and now we can really see that this pawn on d5 is starting to become a real target. Rook d8, queen a2, and here he had only one move to keep the balance, maybe even play for something more, which we totally missed. It was a4, with the amazing idea that after knight d5, not bishop d5, which is the most logical, but rook d5. And after rook d5, knight b3. And now all of a sudden I'm in huge trouble because these bishops are opening up, and I would be already much worse here. So yeah, we both missed this, I think totally understandable. Bishop d5 is more logical, but then after rook d5, this bishop on b7 is missing. And I guess I would be doing well here. He played queen c6, protecting the pawn on d5, and I played rook d2. I calculated some pretty amazing lines here after e4, immediately trying to make use of this pressure on the d file, because obviously he cannot take because the rook on d8 is hanging. But I wasn't very happy with the complications. Also, I missed one huge detail. I calculated only d4. Turns out that black also has some other options. I think bishop a6 was something the computer said. Didn't even think about that. But I thought about d4, and the first thing which I realized that after knight d5, he can simply sacrifice the exchange, and I didn't see a move from me. He's threatening knight g5, and these two bishops are just complete monsters. Also cannot take on d4, because now in the end queen takes h2 would be made. And just to show my point, after something like queen b1, I guess here knight g5 is already deadly. White is simply overloaded, and mate will be coming on h2. So this was the first realization. And the second was that after knight takes d4, queen f6, knight db5, which this was my main line, rook takes d1, rook takes d1. Now, at first I thought I'm just winning. First of all, I'm a pawn up. The rook on c7 doesn't have any squares, which loses material, but he can simply give the bishop on b8. And here, after knight e4, rook e4, I stopped here because I thought I'm simply getting mated, and it turns out this whole variation is correct, and I'm simply lost here. But what I missed was that after queen f6, I have e5. I didn't miss it, I have to admit. I saw after queen e5, knight f3 is what I calculated. And after bishop f3, rook d8, I'm obviously winning because it's check, and we will take, and we won an exchange at least. But after queen f6, black is just doing fine, protecting the rook on d8, and his bishops will now open up. I could even start to get worried here. But what I missed here is the amazing knight c6, and game is just over. I'm winning here. Because now he doesn't have the way to protect the rook with queen f6, because I can still simply take. And yeah, if he takes this, then I simply win the exchange. And yeah, this knight c6 was fantastic, and sadly I missed it. But I went rook d2, which is also quite logical. I simply want to double rooks and put more pressure on the d5 pawn. And here he went f5, which is probably a pretty big mistake. He should go for something like king g7, and even if he gives this pawn here on d5, he will always have some compensation probably, and f5 simply weakens his king's position as well. I played rook d1, rook d7, and now my bishop is coming back to g2, which will help to attack the pawn on d5 sooner or later. King g7, knight d4, this was all quite logical, bishop g2. I went knight d2. Computer argued that I should push b4 at some point. Just kicking this knight out of c5 also earlier was better, but I think how I played was also pretty okay. Knight e2, knight e4. Now I saw during the game that I could first of all, I could take with the knight, but I was not so sure how to break through here in the position. The bishop on d2 is pretty much out of the game, and yeah, the pawn on d5 can be protected by all black's pieces. What I did see was bishop takes e4. fe4 is forced because he cannot take, because then the rook on d7 is hanging. And after fe4, I saw this whole plan with knight f4. Now I have one extra attacker to attack d5. But I was simply, in general, worried that my king is now kind of weak, and I didn't want that to be a problem. But it turns out after queen b3, I'm at least much better, maybe even winning with knight f4 to come. I went rook d4. He played rook d6. Now that after knight e4 that de4 is possible and the rook is protected, I think this was his idea. Knight f4, and here I simply didn't care that he will take on c3. It looks like he ruined my pawn structure, but now I also have the idea of c4, and the pawn on d5 can now really be grabbed sooner or later. So I think this knight f4, this whole idea was better. During the game I thought it would be wiser for him to play knight f6, but it's just super passive, and I don't think that black can survive this this very long either. He went b5, stopping c4 for now, and now I should have really gone a4. I don't know what I was thinking. It's very logical with the idea after ba4, now I push c4, I take on d5 with the piece, and these two pawns will probably also drop off sooner or later. Also cd5 could be an idea, and then knight e6 to come. And after a4, I think what I didn't like was bishop a7, but here I can simply give the exchange. And after queen e7, queen a5, and it's just a disaster for black. The pawn on d5 is still a huge target, king is weak, rook c1, rook c7 could come maybe. Yeah, this is just busted for black. So a4 would have been a much cleaner way to end the game. I played bishop d5, takes, knight d5, bishop a7, and now I made a huge mistake. I played rook d3 with the idea of playing knight f4 next, and I thought I would simply exchange and win the game. But he played queen e4, and now I don't have knight f4 anymore because he will simply take my rook. Rook d2 will be smarter because now knight f4 will come no matter what, basically, and now my queen is protecting the rook, and this is just over. So rook d3 was a blunder, queen e4, and queen b3, queen c4, and this was kind of a huge shock for me because I already realized this might not be so simple anymore. I had to take, and then rook d2, and now I have the problem of this pin here. It's very hard for me to get my knight out. I have to bring my king to e2 first, and then hope the knight could come out somehow. And the rest of the game was, it was just full of mistakes. I will just briefly go through it. Here bishop c5 was a mistake. He should go a4, fixing the pawn on the dark square. And in this variation here, he can simply go into this endgame, and computer says it's just a draw, g5. I'm a pawn up, but the knight can never move anywhere because the pawn on a3 is weak. And yeah, that would simply be a draw. He played bishop c5, allowing me to play a4, g5, f1, king f7. And here was another very instructive moment. I played the very logical king e2. But h3 turns out to be the only winning move. And I want to play g4, so that later on, after these two pawns exchange, for example, like this, then I can fix my knight on d5 with a move like e4. So I really need to get rid of this pawn on f5. What else could he do after h3? Yeah, exactly. h5 was, I think, a very logical move, trying to prevent g4. But now I have h4. And now the square on f4 will become free for the knight. For example, takes, and the knight could later come to f4 after king e2, obviously. Just in general, black never really has king e6 here. He does, but now I have knight c7 check, and I can come out of this pin. For example, takes, and again, it's probably quite important to keep rooks on the board. Rook b1, and this is probably winning for white. But h3, I think, a very instructive moment here. For example, rook d7, also g4, and it's winning. I went king e2, he played rook d7. His idea was now that king e6 is possible without knight c7 check being possible. I played f3, probably the only move to fix the knight. He played king e6, and now I was saying now knight c7 is not possible because he can simply take. And after rook d6, he's lucky enough that the bishop is protecting the rook. So king e6 was actually a mistake. Rook e6 was the only way to draw the game. And then his plan is to play rook e5 and then king e6, so that e4 is stopped. And apparently it's a draw here too. He played king e6. I went e4, takes, king e5. And here I at first totally missed rook f1. I didn't even see that this plan existed. I only saw that after knight e3 I'm even losing this, because here he can take everything, and after g4 I thought I'm simply lost. I'm a pawn up, but I thought this endgame is lost. King f2, king takes e2, king e2, and he simply has a tempo to wait, and he will infiltrate with the king wherever white goes. King d3, or after king d2 there's king f3 and black wins. So that would be a huge shock to lose like this. So my first idea after h3 was that after h5 now I can go knight e3, and in the same line after bishop e3, king e3, g4, h4, and here I'm winning because now black is in zugzwang. So that was my first idea, but then I realized that here, it was not here, that after knight e3 he could take on I mean, first of all, this endgame is pretty unclear too. After king takes e4, knight takes e4, king f3, and now anything could happen. But I also saw a draw somewhere, I think with bishop e3, rook d6, rook d6, rook d6, king d6, king d3, and I thought that this is a draw now, because now again I'm in zugzwang, and if white waits, black can also simply wait, I think. That was my calculation, but I might be wrong. I think white is winning with h4 now. Okay, never mind. Anyway, now after h5, which was a mistake, now I found this rook f1 idea, and he cannot take on e4 because knight f6, and now it's winning once again. So I could have done it earlier. Rook f1 right away would win again. h3 gave away the win because now he could take on e4. And after knight f6, rook f6, this is apparently a draw, rook c2, and he has enough counterplay here. This was in the game, king e4, and here actually, while he was playing king e4, he lost on time. There is no additional 30 minutes after move 40. But anyway, after king e4, knight f6, the game would end as well. And I thought his only way to play on is rook d8, but here in this line, knight f6, I am winning this pawn on g5, and it should also be a win. So yeah, not a totally clean game. I think the opening phase, or at least the middle game phase, was pretty good. Kind of this whole rerouting and playing against the Isolani pawn. But yeah, later on the technique was not up to my level, I would argue. I think the easiest win would have been, as I said earlier, to not take on d5 immediately, but to go a4 first. I think also a very instructive idea here. So yeah, thank you for watching as usual. I hope you enjoyed this recap too, and hope to see you in the upcoming videos. See you soon.